Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending our webinar. I want to welcome all of you to Understanding Canada's COVID-19 Economic Support Programs. First of all, I hope that you are all staying safe and healthy during these challenging times. My name is Angeli Delari. I'm a partner at Logan Katz, Chartered Professional Accountants. We are an public accounting firm that delivers accounting, taxation, assurance, and business advisory services. We're passionate about servicing our clients, and this extends to keeping our clients and community aware and informed with respect to the economic support measures that are out there in order to help during these trying times. I will be presenting the webinar, and I'm joined by my moderator, Stacy Androloska, and she will be moderating the any logistics or questions during the webinar. We've got a lot of content to cover in the next hour, so I'd like to just jump right in. Next slide. Before I begin, as a general comment, please remember that this material that we're presenting is general in nature, and it is not to be used or construed as professional advice. We've done our best to keep everything up to date. It's educational and general in nature, and this information is up to date as of May 14th. Next slide. In terms of the structure of the webinar, I will provide a brief overview, and then we will jump right into some economic support programs for businesses. Then we'll cover some support programs for individuals, and as well filing and payment deadlines, which apply to most of us. And we'll end the session with hopefully we'll have about 10 or 15 minutes for some question and answers as well. The PowerPoint presentation can be made available to participants if you wish after the webinar. Next slide. So as a general overview, the government's been issuing or developing programs that essentially have usually take them years to develop, and they've been putting those out in days and weeks. And as a result, the information is changing rapidly. Clarifications are being made daily, and it is pretty much a full-time job just to keep up with what is out there and what the most current information is. The government issues information through backgrounders, through FAQs, and through specific application guidance, as well as their own news releases. And because there is a lot of information out there and it can get confusing, I would really recommend that you always start with the Government of Canada's website. Their main page, which outlines all of the programs, I've listed the link here, is the best place to start. And then from there, you can make sure that you're keeping abreast of all the programs that might be available to you. There are great resources available on that website, and I strongly encourage you to use that as your source of information. As well, we at Logan Katz try to keep you abreast of the changes and the information that's out there through our articles. We also have a COVID information hub, which is a web page dedicated exclusively to the programs. We don't cover them all, but we cover the major programs, and I've listed the link here as well for your reference. Next, please. So the Government of Canada has introduced many measures to support Canadians and businesses facing hardship as a result of the COVID-19 outbreak. And this is sort of just a bird's eye view of what's going on in terms of what the government is doing. There are three main broad areas: support for businesses, support for individuals, and supports for specific sectors. And I wanted to show you this because I want to make sure you understand there's a perspective on what we're covering today and what's out there. What's highlighted in red, under each of these, there are several programs as well. We're going to touch on some of those, but again, I'd like to remind you that there are a lot more programs out there than what we're covering, and you are, again, encouraged to visit the Government of Canada website. As well, all of this is related to federal measures. There are also provincial measures in place in every province, and you should refer to those as well in terms of seeking support. Next slide. So what are we covering in our webinar? Next slide, please. We will be covering 6 economic support measures available for businesses. 3 of them are related to hiring of employees, and 3 of them are related to access to credit. I've listed them here. And the Canada Emergency Commercial Rent Assistance Program is highlighted in red because that's the only program that we're covering today that is not yet available. But we will cover the details that are available as of May 14th. We will also cover 2 specific programs for individuals, and then finally end with the taxes payment and filing deadline with respect to taxes. The programs have been put out very quickly, and in the interest of speed, in order to get money to the hands of those that need it, the documentation requirements are quite low in terms of applying and receiving the benefits. But I would, as a general comment, encourage you and remind you to keep all of the documentation that you have that supports your applicability and eligibility for these programs. There will be a robust post-audit process by CRA, and you want to make sure that you've got all of your paperwork properly compiled to be able to support your applications. Next slide, please. The first program I'll cover is the temporary wage subsidy. So this was one of the first programs that was introduced. It was quite simple and simplistic, and it was meant to provide immediate support to small businesses. This program provides Canadian businesses who employ workers in Canada with a 10% wage subsidy to cover their employee wages. The subsidy of 10% is on an employee's remuneration paid during the period March 18th to June 19th, so a period of essentially 3 months. There are 2 maximums to be aware of in this subsidy program. There is a maximum of $1,375 per employee, and there is also a maximum of $25,000 per employer. The calculation of the 10% is a manual calculation. There's no form to be filled out, and there's no application to be made. You simply reduce your payroll remittances of income tax in order to obtain the benefit. This subsidy is available to Canadian-controlled private corporations that have a business limit and a taxable capital in Canada less than 15 million. So essentially trying to help the small businesses. It's also available to partnerships, individuals, not-for-profits, and registered charities. Next slide. In terms of eligibility, this program, like I said, they wanted to keep it very simple. There's no revenue test. The only 2 tests that are applicable are that you need to have had an existing CRA business number and a payroll program account on March 18th, which is the beginning of the program. And you need to have paid salary, wages, bonuses, or other remuneration to an eligible employee. And an eligible employee is simply someone that's an individual that's employed in Canada. Again, like I said, there's no need to apply. You receive this subsidy through reducing your payroll remittances of income tax. Be careful not to reduce CPP or EI portion of your remittances, only the federal, provincial, and territorial income tax. You can start reducing your remittances with the first period, remittance period that includes that remuneration that was paid between March 18th and June 20th. For example, if you are a regular remitter, you can reduce your remittance that's due to the CRA on April 15th. If your subsidy amount that you calculate, the 10%, is greater than your remittances, you can continue to reduce future remittances. And if you choose not to reduce your remittances, but you would still like to take advantage of the subsidy, you can request a subsidy payment at the end of the year or transfer to next year. There is expected to be a self-identification form that'll come out later. It is not yet available in terms of those that wish to apply for this. The subsidy, like all of the subsidies I'll be covering, is taxable. It is considered government assistance, and it should be included in computing your income in the year received. Next slide. So the second program I'd like to cover, again, in the category of programs for businesses encouraged to hire employees, is the Kanda Emergency Wage Subsidy Program. This is the largest economic program, valued at $73 billion, that's been put out in Canadian history. This program provides Canadian businesses who employ workers in Canada with a 75% wage subsidy to help cover their employees' wages. The 75% is calculated on an eligible employee's eligible weekly remuneration up to a weekly maximum of $847. That's paid in respect of a claim period. The subsidy will be reduced by any subsidy amount under the temporary wage subsidy that we just spoke of. And something that's not as well known is if you apply for the Kanda Emergency Wage Subsidy, and I'll call this CEWS for short from now on, if you apply for the CEWS, you are deemed to have received the temporary wage subsidy. And so in the application, there is a section where you have to calculate that 10% temporary wage subsidy and put that in your application. And your CEWS subsidy will be reduced by the temporary wage subsidy. The CEWS subsidy amount is also reduced by any benefit you have obtained from the work sharing benefit program, which I'll go through later. There is also another sub-subsidy of the CEWS, which is you have the ability for employees that are furloughed in the period you're applying, furloughed being they're on leave with pay, you can obtain 100% refund of your employer-paid contributions to EI, CPP, QPP, and QPIP. This is an additional subsidy on top of the 75%, but only applicable to furloughed employees. Unlike the temporary wage subsidy, the CEWS has no overall maximum. The applicability period for CEWS is March 15th to June 6th. There are 3 claim periods within this period, and a separate application has to be made for each claim period for which you qualify. The claim periods begin with March 15th to April 11th. Period 2 is April 12th to May 9th, and period 3, May 10th to June 6th. Recently, it was announced that this program will be extended past June, but further details have not yet been provided. For now, we have three claim periods to obtain benefits from. This subsidy is available to corporations, individuals, partnerships, not-for-profit organizations, and registered charities. Next slide, please. In order to be eligible, you had to have an open CRA payroll program account on March 15th, and you had to have experienced the required reduction in revenue for 1 or more claim periods. And we'll talk a little bit more about this reduction in revenue, but this is the big test that needs to be met in order to qualify. Unlike the temporary wage subsidy, this test does have some stringent requirements about revenue reduction, and we'll get into those in a few minutes. The application, this program has been opened up for application beginning April 27th, and applications can be made up until the end of October, up until before October. A separate application is required for each payroll account. You do have to wait until the end of the claim period to apply. And another thing to note, which is not as commonly known, is that you must have paid the eligible remuneration that's being claimed for that period. As an example, if you're on monthly salaries and your May salaries, in that case, are paid, for example, on June 1st. The second claim period is April 12th to May 9th. There are 9 days of May in there. Therefore, because of this requirement that you must have paid the eligible remuneration before claiming it, you can only apply for that second period on June 1st. There are 3 ways to apply: My Business Account, through Represent a Client, and through the Web Forms application. This subsidy is taxable, and it is considered government assistance. Next slide, please. So we'll take a look at the revenue reduction test. This test must be met in order to be eligible for a claim period. The test essentially is that you need to have experienced a decline in your revenues for the month of March of 15%. That will be related to claim period 1. For the month of April of 30%, and for the month of May of 30%. Each of these months relate to a claim period. The benchmark that you use to determine whether you have a decline in revenue is the same month in the prior year. So, for example, March 2020 revenues must have decreased by 15%, at least 15%, as compared to March 2019 revenues, and so forth for April and May. Revenues mean any inflow of cash, accounts receivable, or considerations that arise in the course of ordinary activities carried out in Canada. This would be from the sale of goods, the rendering of services, the use by others of your resources. You are to use your normal accounting methods when determining revenues, and you are to exclude non-arm's length revenues, any extraordinary items, any amounts on account of capital, and the COVID subsidies themselves. There are a couple of electable options that are worth noting for this revenue reduction test. The first option is that you can choose, instead of using your benchmark as the calendar month in 2019, you could use the average of January and February 2020 revenues as a comparison point instead. This would be an election. This can be handy for those companies or businesses that did not have operations in 2019. So you have a choice to use either March, for example, March 2019, or the average of January, February 2020. Same thing for April. You have a choice to use April 2019 or the average of January, February 2020, and the same for May. You also have a choice on the basis of revenue. You can choose to use the accrual basis of measuring revenue or the cash basis. The electable option is the cash. The default option is accrual. As well, for not-for-profit organizations, you can choose to include your revenue from government sources or elect to exclude revenue from government sources. It's important to note that for these 3 elections, whatever election you decide to use, you will need to apply that election for all 3 claim periods. As well, you will need to keep your elections on file as part of your documentation to support your claim. There are a couple of special rules which are applicable in specific circumstances, and there are joint elections that are required for those. These rules essentially related to consolidated entities, affiliated group of entities, and joint ventures all essentially say you can use the consolidated revenues of the group or use the revenues of each member of the group in determining the revenue reduction test. But it is a joint election. All need to decide together. You don't necessarily need to make the same election for every claim period. You can change that election for claim period 1, 2, and 3. In the case where your revenues are greater than 90% from non-arm's length parties, there's a special method that you can use to determine whether you qualify for the revenue reduction test. I won't get into that here, but it is available on the Government of Canada website. You have a separate test for each claim period, so you can meet the test for your first claim period and not meet it for the second. You can meet it for all 3, but essentially you need to apply that revenue reduction test per claim period. You don't need to meet it for all 3. There is a deeming rule that I wanted to mention here, which is that if you meet the revenue reduction test for 1 claim period, you automatically are deemed to meet it for the immediately subsequent claim period. That's an important thing to remember, that, for example, if you meet the 15% revenue reduction test for March, you're automatically good for April, even if your April revenues are not declining more than 30%. Next slide, please. So once you've determined that you meet the revenue reduction test for a specific claim period, what can you claim? Well, before you look at what you can claim, you have to ensure that you have eligible employees. Eligible employees are those that are employed in Canada in the claim period, and they cannot be without remuneration for that claim period for 14 or more consecutive days. You can have a new employee, meaning one that was hired after the program began hired after March 15, and they can be eligible employees as long as they're arm's length. A common question is, can you retroactively hire back your employees to some point earlier in the claim period? And the answer is yes, you can, but you must retroactively pay them in respect of that claim period, and you must consider, the employee must consider whether they may need to pay back any subsidy that they received with respect to the Kanda emergency response benefit. That onus would be on the employee to do that, but you would be wise to inform your employees of that if you're hiring them back retroactively. Once you've determined that you have eligible employees, you have to determine whether you have eligible remuneration. Eligible remuneration is any amount that's paid in respect of a claim period as salary, wages, other remuneration, certain taxable benefits as long as they're paid, fees, commissions, and amounts paid for services. Essentially, these are amounts on which you're generally required to make payroll deductions. That's a good rule of thumb to use when you're trying to figure out if something would qualify as eligible remuneration. Eligible remuneration specifically excludes retiring allowances, stock option benefits, and certain repayable amounts. These are amounts where you would try to set up, where someone would try to set up an arrangement where they'd, in order to claim or enhance the CEWS subsidy, they would make an arrangement where the employee would pay it back later. That's specifically not allowed, as it's bordering on fraudulent in nature. The other remuneration that you need to look at, because it will affect your calculation of what you can receive, is called baseline remuneration. Baseline remuneration, or otherwise referred to as well as pre-crisis remuneration, is the average weekly remuneration that was paid between January 1st and March 15th, inclusively, and it excludes any 7-day period in respect of which the employee did not receive remuneration. And when we get to the next slide, you'll see why that concept is important in determining the amount of subsidy you can receive. Next slide, please. So what is the subsidy amount? You qualify for, you have a revenue reduction, you have eligible employees and eligible remuneration. How much can you receive? So the subsidy amount, typically this is referred to as a 75% wage subsidy, but I'll show you in these examples where it can actually be more or less. The subsidy amount for each week of the claim period will be the greater of 75% of the eligible remuneration paid, always up to a maximum of $8.47 per week, or the lesser of the remuneration paid, or 75% of your baseline remuneration, as I described earlier. So it's a lot of words, and it can be quite complicated trying to figure out what those words mean. So I tried to use an example here just to illustrate. The different columns are three different scenarios. So if you had, before the crisis, if you had a baseline pre-crisis average weekly pay for an employee of $1,000, and then post-crisis, during the eligible remuneration period, you had a weekly pay of $1,100. So the employee's pay actually went up. To apply the formula, 75% of that $1,100 is $825. The lesser of the remuneration paid, $847, or $847 is $847, and 75% of the baseline of $1,000 is $750. So in this case, this is your pure vanilla case. You would get 75% of the remuneration paid, which is $825. In the second column, this example illustrates where you can actually get more than 75% of the remuneration that was paid. In this example, pre-crisis weekly remuneration was $1,000, but post-crisis weekly remuneration went down to $900 a week. In this case, 75% of 900 is $675. However, you are actually allowed to get 75% of your baseline. So your $1,000 that you had pre-crisis is $750, and you can actually get more. So in this case, $750 is what you would get as your subsidy, and not the $675, which is equivalent to 75%. In the last example, I just wanted to show you that in this case, you actually will always be capped at the actual remuneration you pay. So you can never get more than what you actually paid the employee. So again, baseline remuneration is $1,000. The eligible remuneration that was paid was $700. Normally you would be getting $750, but in this case, because you've only paid $700, that's the most that you can get back. There are special rules for non-arm's length employees. A non-arm's length employee must be employed prior to March 15th in order to qualify for SUVs. And the non-arm's length employee will be capped at 75% of the baseline pre-crisis remuneration. I've offered some examples here. In the interest of time, I won't go through them, but you'll see that essentially what this is trying to prevent, if you have a non-arm's length employee, you want to make sure that you're not trying to artificially bump up your wages to get a higher SUS subsidy. So they've limited it to what you normally would have gotten pre-crisis. Next slide, please. Just as a summary, I wanted to just offer up this table to say in period 1, your claim period is March 15th to April 11th. You are required to have a revenue reduction in this claim period of 15%. How do you determine that revenue reduction? You look at the reference period of March 2020 over March 2019 or the average of January and February 2020. For period 2, April 12th to May 9th, you need a 30% reduction in revenue. How do you qualify? You can either have been eligible for period 1, remember the deeming rule, or your April 2020 revenues show a decline of 30% or more over April 2019 or the average of January and February 2020, and so forth for period 3. Next slide. So those were the two programs I wanted to cover in respect of hiring employees. I'd like to cover the Kanda Emergency Business Account Program now. which is a program that is available to provide credit. This program will help cover operating costs during a period where revenues have been temporarily reduced due to COVID-19. So essentially, it's a government guaranteed interest-free loan of $40,000. 25% of this loan is forgiven if you repay the balance of the loan by December 31st, 2022. And then thereafter, the unpaid remaining balance will be converted to a 3-year term loan at interest of 5% annual interest paid monthly, again, effective January 1st, 2023. Who is eligible for this loan? Small businesses, not-for-profit organizations, unions, charities, and other organizations that have a registered T2 or T3010, and that they would have a portion of their revenues generated from the sale of goods or services. The eligibility criteria are quite simplistic here. A Canadian business has to have been in operation March 1st, 2020, has to have had a federal tax registration as of that date, and requires 2019 annual payroll between $20,000 and $1.5 million. This was recently expanded. Originally, the threshold was a little more narrow. They've opened that up, and now you're required to have an annual payroll between the ranges of $20,000 and $1.5 million. How do you apply for this? You would apply for this through your financial institution. Your primary financial institution where you have an active business checking or operating account is where you would apply. And just a sort of commentary, we've noted that you do need to have a business checking or operating account and not a personal checking or operating account in order to be eligible. Again, the purpose of this is to pay non-deferrable operating expenses, which include payroll, rent, utilities, but essentially it cannot be used to make payments of dividends or distributions or increases in management compensation. Next slide. The next program that's available, I wanted to cover this briefly, is called the Business Credit Availability Program. And in fact, there's actually two programs within this overall heading. One is the EDC loan guarantee. This is a program where where the EDC will guarantee term credit and cash flow loans. They'll guarantee them at 80%. And the other program is a BDC co-lending program where BDC works with your financial institution. BDC will will finance 80%, and the financial institution will finance the remaining 20%. This is also a term loan for operational and liquidity needs of businesses, which can include interest payments on existing debt. This would be an interest-only loan for the first 12 months, and then thereafter a 10-year repayment period. This is open for small and medium-sized enterprises. There is no payroll threshold on this, like we had for the Kanda Emergency Business Account, the $40,000 loan. Eligibility, this is available to Canadian businesses in all sectors. The business has to have been otherwise financially viable and revenue generating prior to COVID-19. It's available to exporting and non-exporting companies. And the eligibility criteria will be based on the criteria that's established by the financial institution. You do have to access these programs, again, through the financial institution. Next slide. The next program I want to cover, and I'll just touch on this briefly, is the Kanda Work Sharing Program. This program falls into a program that's encouraged at hiring employees. And essentially, this is an existing program that has just been enhanced to adapt to provide COVID relief. It provides EI benefits to workers who agree to reduce their normal working hours and share the available work while the employer recovers from the decline in business activity. It's available to private businesses, publicly held businesses, not-for-profit corporations. In terms of eligibility, your business must have been in operation for at least 1 year. It must be a year-round business. You must have at least 2 employees in a work-share unit, and that work-share unit would have to have reduced hours of at least 10 to 60%. To apply for this, you would apply through an application form via email, and all of the information is available, like I said, on the government website. The next program I wanted to cover is the Kanda Emergency Commercial Rent Assistance Program. This is another program under the umbrella of access to credit. This program, again, like I said earlier, is not yet available, but it is a program that's providing relief for small businesses experiencing financial hardships due to COVID-19. Essentially, the program will lower April, May, and June rent by 75% for small businesses that have been affected by COVID-19. The way they will do this is to provide forgivable loans to eligible commercial property owners to cover 50% of the gross rent that's owed by the impacted eligible small business tenants. It is applicable for the periods of April, May, and June. It's available to small businesses, not-for-profit organizations, and charitable organizations. The program is not yet available, but it's expected to be available later this month, and the deadline to apply will be August 31st, 2020. Next slide, please. With respect to eligibility, as the program flows through property owners, the 3 criteria for property owners are they need to have been the landlord of a commercial real property that was occupied by an impacted small business tenant. They have to have entered into a rent reduction agreement for the period of April, May, and June that will reduce the impacted small business tenant's rent by at least 75%, and that includes a moratorium on eviction for the period April, May, and June. And they must have declared rental income on their personal or corporate tax return for the 2018 or 19 year. Who is an eligible small business tenant? 3 criteria. You've paid no more than $50,000 in monthly gross rent per location. You've generated no more than $20 million in gross revenue, annual revenues, and you have experienced at least a 70% decline in pre-COVID revenue. So that's a pretty stringent test, and I know that there's been a lot of criticism that leaves some businesses out of the loop, but that's the guidance so far, is that you will have to experience a 70% decline. In terms of determining that decline, you can use the same comparable calendar month in 2019, or you can use the average of January and February 2020 revenues. Next slide, please. So that summarizes or concludes the programs under the business umbrella. I wanted to cover 2 programs that are available to individuals. The first one being the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, often referred to as the CERB. This program provides temporary financial support to employed and self-employed Canadians who have stopped working because of COVID-19. It'll provide a payment of $2,000 for a 4-week period, essentially $500 a week, for a maximum of 16 weeks. The period we're looking at is the period from March 15th to October 3rd. This is available, like I said, to individuals. Applications can be made for each 4-week period of eligibility, and they can be done through CRA My Account, My Service Kanda, or through an automated phone service. These benefits are taxable and will be reported on next year's tax filing. Next slide, please. In terms of eligibility, you had to be a resident of Kanda, at least 15 years of age, with a valid social insurance number. You had to have stopped working because of COVID-19. Examples are workers who had to stop because they were sick, taking care of someone that was sick, parents that had to stay home to take care of their children, and wage earners and self-employed individuals that were not otherwise eligible for EI. You had to not voluntarily quit your job. That's a key point here for the CERB. You cannot have voluntarily quit your job to be eligible. You had to have income of at least $5,000 in 2019 or in the 12-month period immediately preceding the date of your application. That $5,000 income includes all employment income, self-employment income, tips declared as income, honoraria, royalties, and non-eligible dividends. So these are the dividends that are paid out of corporate income tax at the small business rate. You are allowed to earn up to $1,000 per month while collecting the CERB benefit. Next slide, please. The next program that I wanted to cover was the Kanda Emergency Student Benefit. This benefit is recently got introduced. It provides temporary financial support to eligible post-secondary students and recent post-secondary and high school graduates who are not otherwise eligible for the CERB benefit I just discussed, or EI, or are unable to work due to COVID-19. It will provide a payment of $1,250 for each 4-week period for a maximum of 16 weeks within the eligibility period. And there also is an additional support available of $750 for each 4-week period for those that have disabilities or have dependents. The periods of this program range from May 10th to June 6th, and it's broken down into 4 claim periods that I've listed on the slide. It's important to note that for high school graduates, the high school completion date will determine the eligibility period that you can apply for. So the high school completion date must be before the start of the eligible period. This is available to individuals, post-secondary students, and recent graduates. Next slide, please. So the eligibility criteria here are that you must be a Canadian citizen or permanent resident, registered Indian or protected person. You cannot have applied for or received the CERB or EI benefits for the same period. So if you qualify for the CERB or EI benefits for the same period, you should be applying for the CERB. If not, this is a second option for you. You would have to be studying in Canada or abroad and meet one of these conditions. You're either enrolled in a recognized post-secondary educational program or you're completing such a program in December 19 or later. Also for high school students, if you've completed high school in 2020 and have applied for a post-secondary educational program that starts before February 2021, you are also eligible for this. You have to meet one of the following criteria as well. You have to be unable to work due to COVID. You have to be looking for work but can't find work, or you're currently working during the COVID pandemic, but your income from employment or self-employment is less than $1,000 or less during that 4-week period. It's important to note that you have to be looking for work during this in order to qualify for this. One way to demonstrate that you're looking for work and one way to actually look for work is to register with the Government of Canada Job Bank. Next slide, please. Application. So application for this program opened this morning at 6 a.m. and it will be open up until the end of September. You can apply very similar to the CERB through CRA My Account, My Service Kanda, or by calling their automated phone service. And like the CERB, the benefits are taxable. Next slide, please. With respect to filing and payment deadlines, for businesses, there are a number of filing and payment deadlines that I wanted to cover here. For T2 corporate tax returns that had a filing deadline that was due between March 18th and June 1st, your filing deadline has been extended to June 1st. For registered charities with a filing deadline from March 18th onward, your deadline has been extended to December 31st. With respect to payments of income tax, any income tax balances that were due from March 18th onward under Part 1 of the Income Tax Act are now deferred to September 1st. So this is with respect to payments. With respect to GST, HST, and custom duty payments, Any payments that were owing from March 27th onward are now deferred to June 30th. The T1134 returns have been extended as well. It's important to note what hasn't changed. The filing deadline for December year ends, which is 6 months after their year end being June 30th, has not changed. GST HST filing deadline has not changed. There are no changes to payroll amounts or payment amounts or filings. And SHRED and SHRED-related claim filing dates have not changed. With respect to individuals, salaried employees, the deadline to file your T1 is extended to June 1st. Self-employed individuals who always had till June 15th, that deadline has not been extended. Deadline to pay your taxes, your personal taxes, has been extended to September 1st. For filing objections, any filing date for an objection request due March 18th or later is extended to the end of June.